At 2:17 a.m. on the morning of July 13, 1863, the United States Army ceased to exist in New York City. Not on paper, not officially, but in reality. For nearly 48 hours, the federal government lost control of its soldiers, its police, its laws, and its authority inside its largest city. The American flag still flew, the Union still existed, Abraham Lincoln was still president, but New York was no longer under American rule. It was under the control of mobs. Historians later called it a riot. That word is a lie. What happened in New York City during the summer of 1863 was not chaos. It was a temporary collapse of the American state, caused not by foreign invasion, not by secession, but by a single piece of paper issued by the federal government itself: the draft notice. A war the city never agreed to fight. By 1863, the Civil War had been raging for over 2 years, but to many people in New York City, it was still a distant conflict. The battles were in Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi. The dead were reported in newspapers, not buried in city streets. New York was rich. New York was busy. New York was profitable. Its docks fed the Union Army, but they also quietly traded with the Confederacy. Cotton still moved. Money still flowed. Wall Street bankers financed war bonds in the morning and Southern trade in the afternoon. The city was loyal, but only as long as loyalty was profitable. Then, in March 1863, the federal government made a decision it had never made before. It decided that citizenship meant obligation. Congress passed the Enrollment Act, authorizing the first nationwide military draft in American history. Every male citizen between 20 and 45 was now eligible to be forced into military service. On paper, it was equal. In reality, it was explosive. For $300, a sum equivalent to nearly a year's wages, a drafted man could buy his way out, or hire a substitute to die in his place. This single clause transformed the draft from a military necessity into a symbol of class war. The newspapers called it commutation. The working poor called it legalized slavery. The city that was already on edge. New York in 1863 was a powder keg long before the first draft notice arrived. Hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants crowded into tenements. They worked dangerous jobs, earned barely enough to survive, and were openly despised by much of the political elite. They had not come to America to fight for black emancipation. Many feared that freed slaves would flood north and compete for the same jobs they barely held. A rumor spread through the docks and taverns. This war isn't for the Union, it's for rich men and freed slaves, and poor men are the fuel. It wasn't true, but it felt true, and in history, feelings often matter more than facts. Monday morning, July 13th. The first draft lottery in New York City began on a Monday morning. Officials believed the process would be boring. Numbers would be drawn, names would be recorded, men would grumble and go home. They were catastrophically wrong. At around 9 a.m., a crowd gathered outside the draft office on 3rd Avenue. At first, it was just shouting, then bricks, then iron tools stolen from nearby construction sites. Within minutes, the draft wheel was smashed. By noon, the city was burning. When authority vanished. Police stations were overrun. Officers were beaten in the streets. Some were stripped naked and left unconscious. Telegraph lines were cut. Firefighters were attacked for trying to stop the fires. The mayor vanished from public view. The governor was out of the city. The army? Most of it was hundreds of miles away, fighting at Gettysburg. For the first time since the War of 1812, an American city faced total internal collapse with no federal force capable of stopping it. And then the violence crossed a line it could never uncross. The lynching at Fifth Avenue. The mobs didn't just target draft offices. They targeted symbols, newspapers, Republican homes, courthouses. Then they targeted people. African Americans were hunted in the streets. Homes were burned. Orphanages for black children were set on fire while children were still inside. One man was dragged through the streets and lynched from a lamppost near Fifth Avenue. His body was mutilated. Crowds cheered. This was no longer protest. This was terror. Lincoln's worst nightmare. In Washington, Abraham Lincoln received reports that made his blood run cold. He was already fighting a civil war. Now, the largest city in the Union, its financial heart, was effectively in rebellion. There was no constitutional playbook for this. The president faced a brutal choice: allow New York to burn and risk rebellion to other cities, or turn battle-hardened Union troops against American civilians. Lincoln chose force. Soldiers versus citizens. Fresh from Gettysburg, exhausted Union regiments were rushed north by train. Men who had survived artillery barrages and mass infantry charges now found themselves ordered to fire on fellow Americans. Street by street, the Army retook New York. Cannons were deployed at intersections. Rifle volleys echoed between brick buildings. By Thursday evening, the riots were over. Officially. The aftermath no one likes to talk about. At least 120 people were killed. Unofficial estimates suggest many more. The city paid millions in damages. The draft continued. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time, the United States government had learned a terrifying lesson. It could win wars abroad and still lose control at home. That lesson would echo forward into labor wars, civil rights clashes, Vietnam protests, and beyond. The New York draft riots were not an accident. They were a warning. America ignored it.
By Friday morning, newspapers declared New York calm. That word, calm, was carefully chosen. Not safe, not just, not healed. Calm. Because calm simply meant that the mobs were gone, the fires were extinguished, and the bodies had been removed from public view. The city still smelled of smoke and blood. Union soldiers remained stationed at key intersections, bayonets fixed, cannons loaded, not pointed at foreign enemies, but at American streets. Order had been restored by force, but legitimacy had not. The quiet cover-up. Almost immediately, a second operation began. Not military, narrative. City officials downplayed the scale of the violence. Newspapers loyal to the Union emphasized criminal elements and foreign agitators, framing the riots as the work of irrational mobs rather than the predictable result of federal policy. The word class disappeared from the conversation. So did the word race, except when black victims were blamed for provoking violence by their mere presence. No federal inquiry was launched. No commission studied the causes. No national reckoning followed. America had learned something frightening about itself and chose not to look too closely. The draft that could not be stopped. Despite the bloodshed, the draft continued, not because it was popular, because it was necessary. The Union Army was bleeding men at a rate no volunteer system could sustain. Gettysburg had been a victory, but it was also a slaughter. thousands of empty uniforms waited in armories. The government quietly increased police presence at draft offices. Soldiers stood nearby. Cannon were positioned out of sight, but within range. The message was clear. Resistance would be met with overwhelming force. This was the first time the federal government demonstrated inside a major American city that consent was optional. A precedent is born. The New York draft riots created a precedent that would echo for generations, not legally, practically. The lesson was simple and brutal. If the survival of the state is at stake, the state will use violence against its own population and justify it afterward. This lesson did not end in 1863. It migrated from New York to the coal fields. In the late 19th century, when coal miners in Pennsylvania struck for safer conditions and fair wages, state militias were deployed against them. When Pullman workers shut down railroads in 1894, federal troops fired on civilians. When veterans marched on Washington in 1932, demanding promised pay, tanks rolled through the Capitol. Each time, officials invoked order. Each time, newspapers blamed disorderly crowds. Each time, the deeper cause, economic desperation colliding with state power, was quietly buried. The blueprint was New York, 1863. The men who remembered. Among the Union soldiers sent to suppress the riots were veterans who would later become officers, governors, senators. They remembered firing into crowds. They remembered how quickly a city could turn. They remembered how fragile authority truly was. And when later crises came, labor unrest, racial violence, anti-war protests, they did not hesitate. History is not just events. It is memory carried forward by those who survive. Lincoln's private fear. Abraham Lincoln never publicly spoke at length about the draft riots, but in private correspondence, his anxiety is unmistakable. He feared not rebellion from the South, he feared collapse from within. If the people withdraw their support, the war is lost. New York came terrifyingly close to proving him right. Why this story was never central. The American Civil War is often framed as a moral struggle, slavery versus freedom, union versus secession. That story is true, but it is incomplete. The draft riots expose another truth, that even a just cause can fracture society, that even democracy can require coercion, that even the good side can lose moral control. These are uncomfortable truths, so they were minimized. The city that learned nothing. Within a decade, New York was booming again. Immigrants kept arriving, money kept flowing. The riot scars faded from the streets, but not from the structure of American power. The state had learned it could survive popular rage, and the people had learned something else, that protest could be crushed if it threatened the machinery of war or profit. This mutual understanding, unstated but deeply internalized, became part of the American system, the long shadow. When modern Americans watch footage of troops deployed during protests and say, "This feels new," it isn't. It feels forgotten. The night America lost control of its own army was not an anomaly. It was a rehearsal, and rehearsals shape the future.
1. The name on the paper. The paper was thin, cheap, official. It arrived folded once, slipped under the door of a tenement room on the Lower East Side. The ink had already begun to blur slightly in the summer humidity. Michael O'Rourke, age 26. Occupation, dock laborer. Status, drafted. Michael stared at the notice for a long time before he read it a second time. He could not read very well, but the number, $300, stood out clearly. $300 to avoid service. $300 might as well have been $3,000. He earned less than $1 a day unloading ships that reeked of salt, sweat, and rotting cargo. His hands were permanently cracked, his back already bent. The paper was asking him to die.
or to find money that did not exist. A war he did not choose. Michael had not voted for Abraham Lincoln. He had not voted at all. He had come to America to escape hunger, not to fight in a war whose purpose he did not fully understand. He knew slavery was cruel, but cruelty had followed him across the ocean. What he understood was this: men like him were being taken. Men like his landlord were not. That understanding hardened into something darker: resentment. 2. The soldier who came home to fire. Private Thomas Hale had survived Gettysburg. Barely. He still heard the artillery in his sleep, still smelled burned powder when the wind shifted just right. He had watched friends disappear into smoke and never reappear. 3 days after the battle ended, he was ordered onto a train. Destination: New York City. No rest, no leave, no explanation beyond a single line: civil disturbance. When he arrived, the city looked nothing like home. Buildings blackened, windows shattered, streets clogged with debris and ash. This was not the enemy he had trained for. Orders without comfort. Hale's commanding officer was blunt. You will fire if ordered. You will not hesitate. Someone asked what would happen if the crowd included women, children. The officer did not answer. The silence was the answer. For the first time, Hale wondered whether surviving the battlefield had only brought him to a different kind of hell. 3. The man with the pen. Charles Winthrop had a front-row seat to history. As a junior reporter for a New York newspaper, he moved freely through the city until the riots made that dangerous. He watched mobs burn buildings. He watched soldiers load rifles. He watched politicians retreat behind locked doors. But what disturbed him was not the violence. It was the coordination. This was not random. This was a city acting on shared fury. Winthrop took notes furiously, believing, naively, that truth would matter. The moment everything broke. On the second night, Michael O'Rourke joined the crowd. He did not go with the intention to kill. He went because standing still felt like surrender. Someone shouted that soldiers were advancing down 2nd Avenue. Panic rippled. Bricks flew. Gunshots cracked the air. And then, a volley. Private Hale fired because everyone else did. He did not aim. He could not remember aiming. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay motionless. One of them was Michael. Aftermath without closure. No charges were filed. No investigation followed. Michael's body was buried in a mass grave. Hale returned to his unit, his hands steady, his mind not. Winthrop submitted his article. It was edited. The language softened, the anger removed, the dead reduced to statistics. This was how history would be preserved. The real legacy. The draft riots were not just a breakdown of order. They were a test of how far a democracy could go to preserve itself, a test of how much violence could be normalized, a test of whether memory could be managed. The government passed. The people paid. Why this still matters. Every time the state deploys force domestically, the shadow of 1863 is present. Every time emergency powers are expanded, then quietly retained. Every time unrest is framed as disorder rather than symptom. The story did not end in New York. It merely changed uniforms. The numbers that never matched. Officially, the death toll of the New York draft riots was 119. That number appeared in reports. It appeared in speeches. It appeared in textbooks. It was also, almost certainly, false. Hospitals recorded more bodies than the city admitted. Churches buried the dead without names.
Police logs listed unknown male again and again until the ink ran thin. Some bodies were never logged at all. They were burned. They were dumped into the river. They were buried quietly at night. Later estimates from doctors, clergymen, and undertakers suggested the true number was closer to 500. The discrepancy was never resolved. It didn't need to be. Paper is power. In the weeks following the riots, a remarkable thing happened. The federal government began collecting paper, telegrams, arrest lists, after-action military reports, not to publish them, to archive them. Buried in filing cabinets, these documents formed a shadow history, a record of what the state was willing to do when survival felt threatened. One telegram sent from New York to Washington read, "Order restored by decisive force. Recommend no further public comment." That single sentence would become a template. The silent legal shift. There was no new law passed after the riots. None was needed. Instead, interpretation shifted. The Constitution did not explicitly allow for military suppression of civilian unrest, but it did not forbid it either. Silence became permission. From that point forward, the federal government operated under an unspoken rule. If necessity is declared loudly enough, legality will follow quietly. This doctrine would reappear again and again, always framed as temporary, always remembered as precedent. The city rebuilt on forgetting. New York rebuilt quickly. Insurance paid out, buildings rose, streets were cleaned. The sites of the worst violence were repurposed: markets, apartments, offices. There were no plaques, no memorials, no official remembrance of the black victims, the immigrant dead, or the soldiers ordered to fire. Memory was inconvenient, and inconvenience is the enemy of progress. The reporter who wouldn't let go. Charles Winthrop did not forget. Years later, long after he had risen in his profession, he attempted to write a retrospective piece, an honest account of what he had seen. No paper would publish it. Editors warned him gently. Too divisive, too inflammatory, too old to matter. He saved his notes anyway. They would be found decades later in a private collection, cited briefly by historians, then returned to obscurity. Truth had survived, but barely. The Soldiers' Second War. Private Thomas Hale returned home after the Civil War ended. He lived. That was considered success. But he never spoke of New York. Friends noticed he avoided crowds. He flinched at sudden noise. He drank more than before. There were no terms like trauma or PTSD. There was only silence. The nation moved on. He did not. The pattern repeats. In 1877, when railroad workers struck nationwide, troops were deployed again. In 1892, during the Homestead strike, armed forces faced civilians. In 1919, during the Red Summer, cities burned and authority fractured. Each time, officials insisted the situation was unique. It never was. The playbook was written in blood on New York streets in 1863. Why America never teaches this properly. The draft riots complicate the story America prefers to tell. They challenge the idea that the Union was morally unified. They expose class and race fractures within the good side. They reveal that state violence is not an aberration, but a tool. These truths are not flattering, so they are minimized. The quiet conclusion. America did not collapse in 1863, but it cracked, and instead of repairing the crack, it built over it. The structure held, but the weakness remained. Every time the nation faces internal unrest, that weakness hums beneath the surface, old, familiar, waiting. The night America lost control of its own army was not a failure of the past. It was a warning for the future.
When the past learned to wait. By the early 20th century, the United States had become very good at something it never wrote down: delay. Not denial, not correction. Delay. When unrest appeared, the government no longer rushed to explain itself. It acted first, explained later, and sometimes never. This was not accidental. It was learned behavior. 1919, the year the script was reused. The end of World War I did not bring peace. It brought fear. Workers demanded higher wages. Black veterans returned home unwilling to accept second-class citizenship. Immigrants organized. Radicals spoke openly. The newspapers called it chaos. The government called it subversion. The response followed a familiar pattern. Troops deployed in American cities. Curfews enforced. Meetings broken up. People arrested without clear charges. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer ordered mass raids, later known as the Palmer Raids. Thousands detained, many deported, most never formally charged. The justification was simple: national security. It was the same phrase Lincoln had relied on, the same silence the Constitution had offered, the same gray zone reused. No emergency ever ends cleanly. What history rarely emphasizes is this: emergency powers do not disappear when emergencies end. They linger. They wait. They become options. By the 1920s, federal surveillance was no longer extraordinary. It was administrative. Files were kept, names recorded, associations mapped. Nothing illegal, nothing constitutional either. Just possible. The Depression and the bargain. When the Great Depression struck, desperation replaced ideology. People wanted food, jobs, relief. Franklin Roosevelt offered something unprecedented: federal intervention at a scale never imagined by the founders. Agencies multiplied, regulations expanded, the executive branch ballooned. The Supreme Court resisted, briefly. Then it didn't. The bargain was clear, though never stated: stability in exchange for expanded power. Most Americans accepted it willingly. They always had. 1942, when citizenship became conditional. After Pearl Harbor, fear accelerated everything. Japanese Americans were not arrested for crimes. They were relocated for possibility. Suspicion became sufficient cause. Courts approved, Congress funded, citizens complied. The justification, again, temporary necessity. It never feels permanent when you believe you're on the right side. The Cold War made it normal. By the time the Cold War began, emergency governance was no longer an exception. It was the default posture. Presidents authorized covert operations without declarations of war. Agencies operated in secrecy. Congress received briefings, not control. Citizens were monitored, lists compiled, loyalty questioned. McCarthyism wasn't an anomaly. It was bureaucracy meeting fear. The illusion of control. At every stage, Americans believed they were in control, that the system was working, that checks and balances existed, that power was accountable. And on paper, it was. In practice, speed mattered more than permission. Always had. Why this pattern never breaks? Because it doesn't need to. The United States is not sustained by perfect legality. It is sustained by shared belief. Belief that, number one, authority is legitimate. Number two, actions are necessary. Number three, excesses are temporary. As long as enough people believe this, the system holds. When belief fractures, legality doesn't save it. History already proved that. The quiet rule that governs everything. There is an unwritten rule beneath American governance. If the country believes it is in danger, almost anything becomes acceptable. That rule was not created in 1919 or 1942 or 1968 or 2001. It was forged much earlier, in moments when leaders chose survival over clarity, action over debate, order over principle. And each time, the country told itself a story afterward, a cleaner one, a safer one. What this means now. Every generation believes it is the first to face crisis. It never is. Every generation believes the rules will protect them. They won't.
unless people do. The Constitution is not a machine. It does not run itself. It is a promise, and promises require memory. The danger is not that America will suddenly become something else. The danger is that it already knows how to be this, and has practiced. Quietly.